essentially, we can characterize this. I mean, the vast majority of people in Korea, certainly progressives in Korea, have characterized this as a judicial coup.
Welcome everyone, it's Jeff Rich here from the Burning Archive, and I've got a very special guest with me today. It's KJ No, who's come to speak to us about Korea. Welcome back to the program, KJ.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
It's been a really busy news cycle, KJ, and you've been doing some great work over at the China report at Breakthrough News, including a wonderful interview with Victor Gao, which I'll include a link in the description below for everyone. But in that very, very busy news cycle, a very, very important story about Korea has lost perhaps the attention that it really deserves. There have been a couple of developments recently in South Korea with its upcoming election on the 3rd of June, if I'm not mistaken. Do you want to just give us all a quick update on where things are at with the South Korean politics? And because, you know, we've just had an election in Canada that sort of didn't perhaps go America's way. We've just had an election in Australia that Donald Trump's perhaps been a factor in. There's an election coming up in South Korea and in Japan. So pretty consequential events. So what's the situation there at the moment?
Yes, just to trigger people's memories. If you recall, the President Yoon declared martial law without any justification. He was impeached. His impeachment was recently upheld. And what that does is that triggers snap elections in 60 days. And so the date of the election would have been, the date of the election is June 3rd. Now, the leading candidate to win the election is Lee Jae-myung. He is from the opposition party. And he is virtually a shoo-in, guaranteed to win the election. But the United States does not want Lee Jae-myung, and he has signaled that he might abandon the US-Japanese-Korea military alliance. He could strengthen ties with China, and he could seek a more balanced foreign policy. And this would weaken the US strategic position in China as it is seeking escalation to war with China. And so Morstan, the former U.S. ambassador at large, claimed that Lee Jae-myung wants to turn the country over to the Chinese communists. And then the U.S. Congressional Research Report highlighted the importance of timing in South Korea's electoral politics. And they said, in particular, the timing of the court's verdicts could be important because the presumed front-runner for an early election, Lee Jae-myung, faces multiple court proceedings in which guilty verdicts could render him ineligible for political office. Well, that point seems to have been taken to heart by South Korea's Supreme Court. Lee Jae-myung had been accused by a highly politicized prosecutor's office of a petty process crime. That petty process crime was lying during campaigning. Now, this is at best a small fine, but the prosecutor demanded, and the judge levied, a 1-year sentence with 2 years of parole. And this would have stripped Lee Jae-myung of all his political rights for a decade and prevented him from being a presidential candidate. Well, a few weeks ago, the charge was acquitted in an appellate court, and they ruled that Lee Jae-myung was simply voicing an opinion. It wasn't a lie, and that it required considerable interpretation to construe it as a lie. And therefore, he was free to run. Well, then what happened afterwards was quite shocking, because the South Korean Supreme Court, it was appealed to the South Korean Supreme Court, and the vast number of experts said that the Supreme Court will simply uphold the acquittal in the appellate court. And the other thing to notice is that the Supreme Court usually takes months to rule. They technically have about 3 months to rule, but they've been known to take up to 6 years to rule on cases. And the case prior to this had taken about 2.5 years. Well, they ran with this process, and they actually delivered a verdict in 9 days, which is unheard of in the history of the South Korean Supreme Court. And what's also extraordinary about it is that they reviewed 60,000 court documents in 2 days, which is to say that they didn't. But what they did was they reversed the decision of the appellate court, and they found Lee Jae-myung guilty. And they remanded the appellate court, to redo and to deliver a sentence, okay, which they intend to upheld. And so essentially what's happening is that now that it has been remanded to the appellate court, we could either have no ruling before June 3rd, which is unlikely, because by then, if they didn't deliver a decision by June 3rd, then Lee Jae-myung would be elected and presidential immunity would kick in. What is more likely to happen is that the date for the first hearing of the remand trial is May 15th, and the court could issue a ruling as early as May 20th. That's about 2 weeks before the election date. And it's highly likely that they will simply do what the Supreme Court has told them to do, that is, find him guilty. And it's also highly likely that they will impose some kind of severe sentence on him, which essentially disqualifies Lee Jae-myung from running as president. And essentially, we can characterize this. I mean, the vast majority of people in Korea, certainly progressives in Korea, have characterized this as a judicial coup. The Supreme Court has interfered in the elections. And of course, this fits the geostrategic pattern that we're seeing across the world, where you suddenly see these politicized court cases, Brazil, Argentina, France, Romania, where the court suddenly intervenes and disqualifies or overturns an election. So I think that many people suspect the US hand in this. But essentially, the key point is that the Korean population, the vast majority of Koreans, are outraged. They see this as a judicial coup. They see this as judicial interference. And they also note that the Supreme Court ruling doesn't make any sense. Just to kind of dig a little bit into it, the first court ruled that what Lee Jae-myung said could be interpreted as a lie. He said that they took a picture of it and they cropped out all the other people. It was a picture with 10 people in it, and they cropped out most of the other people and just made Lee Jae-myung and a few other people, and then they claimed that Lee Jae-myung was behaving in corrupt fashions. And what Lee Jae-myung did was he said that they cropped the picture, and the first court said that this could be interpreted as Lee Jae-myung trying to misinterpret or mislead the public, and therefore he is lying, and therefore he should be punished criminally. The appellate court ruled, and I believe ruled correctly, that you had to interpret his statement as a lie, because factually it wasn't a lie, it was actually correct. They had cropped the picture, and therefore the interpretation is subjective. Therefore, it's a matter of opinion, and there it's not inherently true or false. It's not a lie. And what the Supreme Court ruled was that it could be interpreted as a lie, and therefore it is a lie. And note that they have affirmed the appellate court's judgment that it requires interpretation. So it's kind of a logical error to say that something is a lie once you've affirmed that it requires interpretation to be seen as a lie. And even the court couldn't agree with itself, and it certainly disagreed with the appellate court. So it's an extraordinary faulty, jurisprudential ruling. The Koreans are outraged. and they see this as an interference. There's Article 9 of the Constitution, which says that public officials have to remain neutral and they should not exercise any unreasonable influence over the election. But it seems like the die is cast. The appellate court to which it had been remanded is stacked with Yoon Suk-yeol loyalists, as was the Supreme Court. There were 10 of them. Yeah, so, there's Article 9 of the uh, Public Officials Election Act, and it requires any public official, including judges, to maintain political neutrality and to not exercise unreasonable influence over the election or to try to have an effect on the election results. And that is clearly what is happening. And so these highly politicized justices, all 10 of whom were 10 of 12 whom were appointed by Yoon Suk-yeol, and now the appellate court judge who has been assigned the case, again in breakneck terms, within 6 hours, something never seen in the history of Korean, judicial processes, has now been remanded to take on the case. And again, there's extraordinary fear that they will simply find Yoon Suk-yeol guilty, that they will shortcut the secondary appeal process, and Yoon Suk-yeol will be disqualified. And therefore, what that does is it paves open, it leaves the opposition party in complete disarray, and it paves open the road for Han Duck-soo, the current acting president who has just resigned. He was the prime minister, or he is the prime minister, but he has just resigned from his position as acting president, and he has tossed his hat into the ring as a presidential candidate. And Han Duck-soo is the one that the Americans want. He's a, kind of a bland, spineless sycophant that the U.S. who will do U.S. bidding. And so we see all these kind of geostrategic maneuverings happening on, but all of this is to say that the Korean public is outraged. And as I said before, this is the constant twists and turns of South Korean politics.
And what's the expectation in like opinion polls and that sort of thing for the election?
The opinion polls are overwhelmingly in favor of Lee Jae-myung. He would be a shoo-in. There's nobody who even comes close. I think he's like 20 or 30 points ahead of any opposition challenger. Although we haven't seen anything on Han Duck-soo, but Han Duck-soo is a nothing burger. He really is somebody who's so bland. He reminds me of Pan Ki-moon, the former UN Secretary General. He's just so bland and uninteresting that he would not have a snowball's chance in hell to be elected if not for this kind of extraordinary judicial interference. So and when in the primary process, Lee Jae-myung went through a primary process inside his own party, he was elected with 90% support. And so, as I said, he is an absolute shoo-in. But it looks like there's some very, very ugly maneuverings that are happening that are, I believe, fundamentally, obstructing and subverting the political process.
Well, that is really quite disturbing and concerning, and as you say, it's an issue that seems to be happening in quite a few places around the world at the moment, and there really perhaps hasn't been as much attention, at least in the broadly Western media, to this very troubling sort of development in South Korea as there ought to be. So we'll certainly keep tabs on that. Maybe check in with you after June the 3rd if we get there.
If we get there. Let me tell you one more result of this judgment. Essentially, what the South Korean Supreme Court has said, that it has declared that any statement a politician makes while campaigning that is subject to misinterpretation is criminally disqualifying. And so you have put such an extraordinary limit on speech and campaign speech, that you've essentially ended the political process. It's quite an extraordinary judgment
That
that
is.
was put through.
Yeah, well, I'm not really aware of very much political behaviour that wouldn't fall into that ruling. That's extraordinary. Thanks for updating us on that, KJ.
You're welcome.